So this was great. This actually came up with one of my own agents this week, as well as myself. So that's kind of what brought up the topic. It is a delicate subject for some clients. Some clients have had very bad experiences with this. Usually those come from dishonest realtors. That's just what happens. So when you find a dishonest realtor that decides that they're going to essentially put their paycheck above everyone else, that's when you get, junk that happens and people that have bad experiences and they think that dual agency is a bad thing. So I'm going to give you the flip side, because dual agency is a very good thing. And then there's also some positive things that you can explain to your client or pitch to them so that they can understand that you're not going to screw them over, but also that a dual agency situation is actually a real good thing for them, not just for you and your pocketbook. Okay, so we'll talk about those as well. So here we go. All right. How do you explain to your client what dual representation is? And I know it may be called something different by state, but essentially representing buyer and seller. Okay, so this is what you say to your client. So dual representation is when you become a little more of a mediator. Okay, and what I will tell my clients is I don't give price suggestions. I don't give negotiation suggestions. When I become a mediator, or if I'm representing, buyer and seller, at that point, I will turn to, let's say the buyer asks me, hey, I'm representing the seller first, right? And then a buyer comes in and the buyer says to me, well, what should we offer? Okay, at that point, you can't say. You don't give suggestions. So then you just flip it right back at him, and you don't have to say, I don't give suggestions. You just say, well, what do you think? Or what would you be happy with? Okay, so beyond being a mediator, the second part of this is you just want to make sure that whatever the buyer wants and the seller wants, that they match and that everybody's happy with it. If that doesn't match, then the deal isn't good anyway, right? So in explaining to a seller, this is what I'll say to them. I'll say, okay, so, you have an option for dual representation, which means that myself or anybody in my brokerage is able to show the property and bring a buyer. If I were to have a phone call come to me, someone wants to write an offer through me, that would be a dual representation situation. And at that point, I become more of a mediator. I don't give price suggestions. I don't give negotiation suggestions. And then one step beyond that is if a buyer comes to me and it becomes awkward, or if we have any issues to where they're maybe not playing fair, okay, I will not represent them. I will pass them off to somebody else. So if you set that expectation up front, then they're going to feel comfortable. Of course, you have to follow through with that. I dual represent a lot of the time. And I say a lot, probably, 35% maybe of my sales. That might be a high number, but somewhere around there. And in all this time, I've had one client. It was actually the seller who I was representing. And she started lying. And so she had told the buyer one thing, and then she reneges and tells me a different thing. At that point, I didn't feel like I could represent that buyer very well because my seller was lying, right? I needed somebody to fight for her. So I told that buyer, and I grabbed another one of my agents, and I said, I'm going to refer this client to you. You need to fight for her. I can represent the seller. So that type of scenario, and I actually give that scenario to my clients, that, as long as everybody plays fair and is honest, it works really well. If somebody decides to not play fair, then I don't. I will get rid of whoever the second party is, right? Whoever the new one is, and only represent the seller. And that's usually what it is. You have the listing and you pick up the buyer. Do I offer comps to both sides? I can pull data for them if they want data, yes, because that's data and that's not an opinion, right? So I can, if they say, well, we're not sure what to offer, then I can pull comparable properties and then just give them that data and they can analyze it themselves. Honestly, everyone has a happy place. Everyone has some magic spot where they're happy, they're comfortable, and they don't feel like they've been screwed over. That's the place you want them to get to, and that's just what I tell them. As long as you're happy with it and you don't walk away feeling like somebody screwed you over, then it is good. If you're not going to be happy with this price, then you might want to pick a price that you're happy with. I just don't give them number suggestions. Okay. And that's simple. Like that's all I explain to the client. And then at that point, 99.99% of the time, they choose dual representation and they're okay with it. So that's that new role that you're taking on now. When you are dual representing, you have to step into some different shoes and you have to be a lot more careful. Okay, so it's not a normal transaction at this point. It's a little bit more delicate situation. You have to be very transparent. And I say transparent, which means you can't hide things that should be disclosed. You don't want to be transparent on each individual's private information. So again, comes back to the numbers or the seller's motivation or the buyer's motivation. You want to keep it very neutral, but transparent, right? Here's the facts. Here's the data. What's the decision? That's pretty much it. Especially, and then in that transparency, and then in the honesty that goes along with that as well. The honest part is you can't hide defects. You need to make sure that your seller is being as honest as possible. Because if that buyer gets into that house and you represented the seller and something's defective and you weren't disclosing that, or your sellers maybe hadn't disclosed that to you, then guess whose fault it is? Whether it's the seller's fault or yours, it always comes back to you, especially since you dual represented. Okay. And I mean, not for good reason, but you are making a crap ton of money when you dual represent. It's just the way it is. You walk away sometimes with, $15,000, $25,000 paychecks, sometimes more. So you just have to be very transparent, very honest. So pros and cons. So one of the biggest pros is the amount of money that you make, right, when you're dual representing, because you're double ending the transaction. But the second pro that I think is a pro is the flexibility that you have when you are dual representing. So let me give you an example of this. So I have a situation where I dual represented, and the buyer came with a list of items that they wanted fixed on the repair list. And my seller is kind of a stress bucket. And so with that list with the buyer, I just said, yep, I'll take care of all of them. No problem. I'll take care of it. And then to the seller, they said, oh my gosh, what are they asking for? What are they asking for? And I said, oh, well, they're asking for these items, but I'll take care of it. So don't worry about it. You're done. Let's move on, right? Move on to appraisal. Don't worry about it. I say that when they're not like thousands and thousands of dollars of repairs, but I think in this case, it's about $800 worth of small little touch-ups and stretching some carpet and cleaning the house. It's not a huge deal. And again, your seller is going to see how much money you're making when you close. And it matters that you aren't being greedy, honestly. And that is a way to help soften that a little bit, because they are paying you a lot of money, right? And the funny thing is, you could be like, when another agent comes in, they aren't quite as concerned with the fact that they're making this much money and you're making this much money. Like, it's not that big. But when they see it dual represented and both paychecks, both ends are coming to you, it's a shocker. Because it is a shocker, because, if you're walking away with $15,000, $20,000, it is a lot of money, right? That's what some people make in a year. So making sure that you are kind of softening that blow a little bit, I guess that's one of the reasons why I'll do that, is I'll soften that blow so that so you're providing even more value to them. So in their mind, it's not as shocking to pay you so much. Okay. And then also it makes you the hero. And it's always great. I love to be the hero, but it's always great to be the hero, both ends, also helps get you some good reviews, right? Because nobody does that. Nobody pays for everything to be fixed. Nobody doesn't make the buyers argue about it, right? When they come in with what they want, a lot of times they're expecting an argument or a counter from the seller. And if you just say, nope, this is what you want, great, we'll take care of it, then it makes them very happy. All right, here's our cons. Yay, like we need more of this in our lives, but we get it. You get more stress. So you get more stress because you are held at a higher expectation. That's kind of number 2, right? We are held at a higher expectation. You do have to dance around a little bit more carefully around feelings around both of the parties to make sure that everyone feels like they're being very well taken care of and no one feels like they're being taken advantage of. So make sure that you're assessing how you are presenting and taking care of your clients so that nobody feels like you're leaning one direction over the other. That's really important. How do you avoid a lawsuit? That was another question that I put on here, because that's something that you have to worry about. It's very simple. The things that we've already talked about, just do those, right? Your transparency, your honesty, you're making sure that you take care of everyone, keep them happy. That's really important, and it's overly important during a dual situation as compared to if I'm just representing the seller and somebody else has the buyer coming in, I could give a rip. They can, not take advantage, right? But I can play hardball because it's not my client. I'm not representing the buyer. So when I'm just fighting for my seller, it's a whole lot easier to kind of put on like the mean face, right? And just represent my seller. But you can't put on the mean face when you've got both parties. So being very careful with that. Steve mentioned document everything. Yes, everything needs to be documented. You will have a tendency, and I'm saying this because I'm guilty as charged, to bypass some steps. So I'll give you an example. On the one where I'm fixing all the items, I didn't have my buyer write up an inspection request. We didn't do a formal inspection request. I said, what do you want? Here's the inspection report. What do you want? And they said, I want XYZ PQRX, right? And I told my seller, okay, they want these things. I'll take care of it. No issues. Moving on. And we didn't sign anything. So if I were to not follow through, that would be potential for issues, right? Really, should I have it signed? I really should. I should. I didn't. Should. So learn from my mistakes. If repairs, Caitlin asked, if repairs are $1,000 plus, would I also bite the bullet? So the way that so you probably hear me talk a lot about fixing things for people, right? Stuff that costs money, taking care of things. Where do you draw the line and where do you have to be careful with that? So let's say if you've got something like mold, so you have mold, anybody that buys the house, the seller's going to have to repair the mold, right? It's not like the little piddly things or things that people are picking apart that they want fixed. It's a little bit more serious. Or let's say they have like a major water leak. That really should be the seller's responsibility. So anything that really should be a seller's responsibility where they're handing this house over and it's going to have to be in a certain condition in order to be transferred to the new party, that needs to be the seller's responsibility. They should pay for that. If you're on acreage, your water testing, your septic pumping, that's the seller's responsibility. Those are things that you usually tell them up front as well, right? During an inspection, if we have mold, if we have major water leaks, health and safety issues, right? Or if we, and then of course, pumping the septic, inspecting the well, getting the water test, all those things, those are seller responsibilities. And you set that expectation up front so that they know those things will already need to be done. But then when it comes to like the things like the touch-up paint, the carpet needs to be stretched. They want the house, cleaned. Little things like that just to make it nice for your buyer to move in. Those are the things that I'm talking about fixing. Okay, not major items that really the seller should be responsible for. You do have to be careful if you're a fixer. I'm a fixer. And you do have to be careful that you aren't throwing it out there unnecessarily, right, at the very beginning, and giving up all your commission. You do have to be careful with that. The nice thing is with repair items, hold on, I just squirreled for a second because Colleen just asked a question. I'm so bad at that. Okay, so Colleen asks, are things like this that you fix tax deductible, or is that a gift? Okay, so according to tax law, only $25 can be a gift. So up to $25 and beyond that has to be like advertising or repairs, and I'll call them repairs. What you can actually do so that you're not having to pay tax or even deal with the deduction is I will have things fixed, submit the invoice, and this goes back to our first classes in Elevate, okay, somewhere in there. I will have things fixed, submit the invoice to title, have it paid at closing, and so I'll have it come out of the seller's side. It'll show the seller's paying for it, and then I give the seller a credit to offset that. Does that make sense? So there's another reason why that's good is because then the seller actually sees what you're doing, sees the cost of it, and sees that you are paying for that, so you get credit for it. If they never know, and I know this sounds dumb, but if they never know what you put out, what it costs you, how much effort you put in, if you try to do those things like very silently, you don't receive credit for them. They don't know what you've sacrificed for them. So you do want them to have some idea, not in a boastful way, but you want to get credit. If you're going to spend the money on it, get credit for it. Because you're doing something kind, you're taking some stress off of them, and you're paying for something that would otherwise cost them. So that's the way I usually would do that. Then you don't have to worry about the deduction because you never received it to start with. The other thing is, the reason why it's nice to do that is because if you are doing splits with your brokerage, right, I mean, your commission coming in is a little bit less instead of coming in, taking a percentage off of a larger amount, and then you have to pay that invoice after. So a little strategy there, I guess. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? Doing all right so far? Okay, Vicki, go ahead, or type. You can either type it or you can unmute.
Yeah, I kind of missed a little bit in the beginning, but I wanted to ask you when you were talking about red flag, when someone calls and say, I want to just talk to the listing agent, you know, like a lead will come in and a buyer lead. I thought you were the listing agent. I want to speak to the listing agent. Is that like maybe a potential red flag? And then the second part is what could go bad? I guess probably a lot, but what's the worst thing that could go bad with a buyer wanting to work with the listing agent?
Gosh, what's the worst thing? Okay, so let's answer the first question first.
Okay.
So first question is, everybody will inevitably get this. If you get some lead online that was calling on a specific house, they get confused and they think that they are calling the listing agent when they're not, right? So if they call you and they say, oh, I want to talk to the listing agent, I usually just say, well, I have access to all the information. What are you looking for? What can I help you with? And then that derails them pretty quickly, and then they'll just start talking to you. A lot of people are under the misconception that they think that the listing agent holds all the answers or that they will get a better deal if they use a listing agent. That's not true. They think that, so from a buyer's perspective, an uneducated buyer's perspective, they think that if they bypass having an additional realtor and they go straight to the listing agent, that it's going to cost them less money because the listing agent will get paid less. They think it's like half the commission. And that's not true. So they don't quite understand that. So that's kind of a different play. That's a play on if you've got a buyer that thinks that they want to call a listing agent and you're trying to coerce, probably isn't a great word, but you're trying to talk them into working with you, then you need to give them all the reasons why it's good for them to work with you and not with the listing agent. But a lot of that does come in to where there's a lot of dishonest agents out there. Right. And so it's important for them to be protected. Now, on the flip side, right, you're saying like the opposite to your seller. as you're saying, oh, I'm going to, dual represent the situation, but you're explaining to them like you're honest. You're an honest person. This is how I handle the situation. I won't do a dual representation if there's issues or if the buyer's not honest or whatever. Like you have to follow some very clean lines to make this work well and for people to be comfortable and happy with it. But when you can do that, the benefits are really great because it makes it very easy for you to list a property, especially when inventory is low, but you get a listing on a property and you have a list of buyers that maybe fit this property or one buyer that fits the property, and you can stake them in to come see it real quick and get your offer in and make it the best offer, right? I mean, you have that ability on the back end to do that. So that's where things like compound pretty quickly is you can, you can really on the back end see if your buyer's making a good offer or not and where they're willing to go and if you can make it work. The flexibility also comes with if I've got, let's say, so I had a dual representation situation where I had reduced my commission by $1,000 to make my buyer win. But I could because I was making so much money. It was just fine. And then my buyer got a house. Then I didn't have to go out and write 15 offers to try to get an offer accepted, right? I did that like 5 times in a row over this spring. That is one of the only ways I could get my buyers into houses is I would get the listing and I would find my buyer and I'd match them up and I'd make sure our offer was the best and I'd make it work. If I had to do something with my commission, if I had to fix something, I did. Like the market was so competitive. Like that's how I was getting my buyers into houses was by having those listings. You got to have the listings as well. But, you have a lot of, that's the flexibility I'm talking about. You can make things work. You can make stuff happen. There's a lot of power, but there's a lot of power in commission. Now, the only time I do dislike when a seller wants to reduce your commission or tries or asks or whatever, right? And you reduce your commission. If you reduce it by too much, you lose flexibility. At that point, if I've reduced my commission, I'm not going to start paying for stuff and fix the issues because I've already reduced my commission by however much. There's a threshold, right? It's relative. It's relative if I'm selling a $900,000 house or if it's a $120,000 house. It's kind of relative to how much you're making. But still, that's one reason why I don't like to reduce my commission too much because I like to have that flexibility. I like to be able to fix the problems for people because it makes them extra happy. And then they're like raving clients, real happy clients. So holding that commission power is important. The second question Vicki had, because now I already forgot, so you might want to ask me again.
Like, what's the worst that could happen?
Oh, worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Well, worst case scenario, you could end up in court. That's probably worst case scenario. So I would say, if you have got a really where problems arise is where something wasn't disclosed on the seller's end, and then the buyer moves in and they find this defect, and then it's going to be your fault. It's just going to be your fault. They're going to blame you, right? It's the seller's fault. And you have to try to explain to them like it's not something that you knew and there's no way that you have control over that. But they're going to be angry at you. So either they're going to drag the seller into court or they're going to try to drag you into court as well. That can happen. As long as you have crossed your T's, dotted your I's, made sure that you were very transparent, very honest through the whole situation, you'll be fine because it's not your fault. And people can be mad and they can stomp their feet and they can say they're going to take you to court. And that's their prerogative, right? But that doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means that they're angry and upset and childlike. And some people are like that. So I would say that's probably your worst case scenario. But if you get that feeling that someone's not telling the truth, listen to it and act on it. So either you prod to get more information or to inspect something that you think needs to be inspected. I had one where I dual represented, this could have been very bad. I had one where I dual represented, and the mistake that I made was the seller, it was just a piece of land. And the sellers said to me, we have a building right on this property. So in our county, if you don't have the right to build on the property, it goes back to like 1978. If you don't have the right to build, you can't just go get a building permit and build a house. It has to have like an original right to build on the property. Okay. So they tell me we have the right to build on the property. So no joke, I had this property up for sale for like 9 months. All the while, I had never called and verified with the county that they actually had a building right. Okay. Because it was actually a friend of mine. I trusted her. I thought, oh, okay. You have a building right. We're good. She's very educated. Her husband's an engineer. Like they've been doing all this stuff with the county and the city, splitting all these properties. So I figure she knows what she's talking about, right? We get to closing. I have the buyer as well. We get to closing and we're sitting at the table, and I got kind of like a unsettling feeling. And I was like, I'm going to step out for just a second, and I'm going to just check on something. So I step out, I called the county, and I said, I need to verify that we have a building right on this property. And she's like, I'll call you right back, does some research, calls me right back, and she said, no, that property does not qualify for a building right. It was actually under the usable square footage to even be buildable. So there's no way you could ever build a house on it. And I was like, oh crap. Right? So, and that was my sellers were at the closing table at that time. And I had to go back in and say, so sorry that you can't sell this piece of property because there's no building right, and then break the news to the buyer. So positively, like I got it before we made a $35,000 mistake, because that's what the buyers were paying for the property. And at that point, the sellers would have had to buy it back, or they would have ended up in court. I mean, the easy fix is sellers buy it back so that they don't end up in court, right? And then if the sellers were to refuse, then the buyers could take them to court. And then I'd probably get drug into that too, because I didn't call and verify the information. Is it my responsibility? Yes and no. Some agents like to say, oh, buyers need to do their due diligence, right? But we're also here to protect them. And then when you add in the fact that you're a dual agent, you have even more responsibility. So that's where the higher stress comes in. So that was bad. Could have been very bad. My in the back of my head, I was like, oh my gosh, what else would I have done? I would have bought the property back from my clients. I wouldn't want to go to court. It's going to cost me more in going to court than anything, right? But anyway, headed that one off. That's probably the worst case scenario that I've had with dual representation. And luckily my clients were very understanding. And we just closed on a different property, but still scary, right? So you have to be really careful at what you're doing, and just make sure that you're not letting anything sneak by you is all. So, and that's really the bulk of dual representing. I'm going to open it up for questions. If anybody has, have you guys had any scenarios, situations? Have you not felt comfortable explaining the dual representation to your clients? Anybody?
Just the one thing I would add is just, again, if you have acquaintances, we can all feel comfortable. We can talk like we're doing. We can text. I can't stress enough, again, learning experience like Lisa's sharing, document everything in an email. As we just discussed, you agreed to this, this, and this. In the event this happens, this high level recap.
Yeah.
Even if you think it's good and everything's chummy, it's not.
Yeah. And don't let it scare you. I mean, honestly, don't let it scare you from wanting to dual represent. It doesn't have to be a scary thing. You just have to make sure that you're on your game, on your A game, really, so that you're, making sure that you're crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And it's a little bit more work. They think that it's just easy, you're just double ending it and it's so easy, but really it's a high stressful situation that you put yourself in when you do dual represent. It is definitely a higher stress situation. So, but above all, you always want to make sure your clients don't feel it. They shouldn't feel any different. They shouldn't feel like they're not getting represented, right? And I would always do a check-in to make sure, like, how are you, how are you feeling about the situation? Are you comfortable with this? Are you comfortable with, when you do the inspection, and just being very cognizant of how they are receiving the situation too, and what their experience is, and just making sure that that is a good experience, and asking them, because you will get clients who won't speak up. So they're not going to just forthcome and say, man, I feel like you're really not taking care of me. You're going to get passive people that won't do that. They're not going to feel comfortable speaking up and saying that. So you need to make sure that you are asking them so that you know that they are feeling comfortable. You're opening those lines of communication for them. Big. We have.
I
Oh,
would
go
just add to that too, is just you can only represent one party 100% too. So just like with the seller, for example, just I articulate, you have my 100% undivided attention. Like the scales tip towards you, the seller, not the buyer. So kind of puts the seller at peace of mind, gives the seller peace of mind. Buyer, I mean, you're setting the expectation. So,
but you got to split that between both if you're dual representing.
Only one party can have 100% though, correct? Is it different out there?
You're going to be 100%. When you're with the seller, it's 100% with the seller. When you're with the buyer, it's 100% with the buyer. If you're contracted to dual represent, you're splitting yourself in half. It's kind of like having two children and you can't love one child more than the other child, right?
Right.
If one child might be more difficult, you've got to show up equally for both parties. If you are in a situation where you feel like you can't like equally split yourself, that's when you need to call it, and you need to have somebody else represent the buyer. But you've got to, your duty, your first duty is to your seller. That's who you signed a contract with first, right? So when it comes down to it, if crap hits the fan and things aren't going well, you need to get rid of the buyer and you need to represent the seller. But if you are signed to represent both, you got to show up. You got to show up for both of them. Now, there's an option, at least in our state, where you can be a non-agent. And I know it's called different stuff in different states, but essentially you can be an agent for the seller and a non-agent for the buyer. What that means in our state is that you don't have to hold the buyer's information confidential, and you don't have to like fully represent them, because you don't have to look out for their best interest. Well, I don't know about you, but I, in good conscience, can never have a buyer sign a contract with me if that was what I was telling them I was doing, right? And if you're slimy, people are slimy, and people would do that, but not explain it. But I, in good conscience, couldn't put down, oh, well, you're really not worth enough, so I'm not going to represent you and your interests, right? But go ahead and sign all the documents and let me submit them so I can make more money. So I don't think that is good business. Is it legal? Totally. Totally legal. But is it good business practice? It's not good business practice, because then you get one person who feels like they're shafted. And then they're going to go around and tell other people that they got shafted. That's where the importance of making sure that you can show up 100% for each person is important.
Right. And I guess, 99% to the buyer too. So just to be more clear, I mean, yeah, I'm doing purchase agreements and all that stuff, but just kind of like you touched on too, I can't give, how did you say it? I can't tell pricing. I can give opinions.
Yeah, you
No,
suggestions. You can get
no opinions, facts only, I should say.
Yeah. Here's what sold. If they want suggestion on price, here's what sold. Print out the comps, let them look at them, let them make an educated decision. But if you were only representing the buyer, you'd say, oh yeah, we should go in less, right? Or let's see if we can do this or whatever. I mean, so yeah, but the way I always explain it is, right, if what the buyer wants and what the seller wants, if those match together and everybody's happy, then it's great. Then it works well, right? Then everybody has a place, everybody has a happy spot with their price or what they want to sell for or what they want to buy for. Everybody's got some sort of bottom line, top dollar. Everybody has mentally, they've already decided what they actually want to spend. So if those two items can match up between the two parties, then it works. And if they don't match, it doesn't work. And if I can make it work, I'll try. Caitlin says she has a situation where the well test didn't come back in time due to the lab being backed up, so she explained it to her clients representing the buyer that they were okay to go ahead because there was a water filter. Test came back high with arsenic. They haven't said anything, but she feels awful, so she checked into the filter and it's $3,500. Seller will not fix it. Any suggestions? Yeah, that one's rough. So first lesson, don't close until you have all the tests back, because that would be put on the seller. So that would be the first lesson, is make sure, again, that you're not bypassing important things because it's easier to do. I wouldn't have closed before you had test results back. You haven't closed, the seller needs to fix it. So, okay, here's a line that I will use and see if this works or not. If it's not a cash buyer, then you can always tell the seller that the lender is requiring potable water. Blame it on the lender instead of just something that the buyer wants. I blame it on the lender. Lender won't, well, if this lender won't lend on it, no other lender is going to lend on it either. Right? You have tainted water. You need to fix the water.
Just file an amendment, extend an amendment, just on the date that the lab's going to come back with that test result too. Otherwise, you're going to get locked in.
Yeah, and it sounds like what's going on is that you've got a seller that's digging their heels in that doesn't want to pay for something, and they really should, right? In all honesty, it's their responsibility to provide potable water when you sell a property. It really is. So, so they really should pay for that. So Caitlin, you can call me later. We'll talk about that.
On a different note too, Lisa, if it gets down to it, I mean, would you suggest too, just kind of to go back to the other agent, like, look, this is a material fact now. So you're going to have to put this back on the market. So let's work together instead of against each other, and kind of play hardball a little bit, but in a fair way.
Yeah.
Would you recommend something like that?
So the way I would take this, so there's a few different steps. The first line of defense is, of course, you ask for it to be fixed, and then they say no, right? Then the next thing you say is, well, the lender's requiring it. So would you please talk to your seller, because the lender is requiring this be, have potable water. So please fix it. Okay. Hopefully that works. But then sometimes you either get an agent that's difficult, which I know it's not because I know the other agent on that one, but you either get an agent that's difficult, and you will get those that just say like, oh, screw you, whatever, I'm not going to help anything. I mean, you get them, and you can't make them do anything, and you can't tell them anything. You can't reason with them. Like, you get that type of agent sometimes that you have to work with. It's really frustrating. You want to beat it into them, and you just can't. So at that point, if they absolutely won't have the seller fix it, or they're like, whatever, like, we'll sell the house to somebody else, we don't care, right? Then you're stuck, and that's when you have to make a decision. Okay, and that's when I look at myself and go, okay, first line of defense is I will ask the buyer. Okay, buyer, like, they won't fix it. How bad do you want the house? Do you want to spend the $3,500 to correct the problem yourself? So the first thing you do is put it back on the buyer and give them an option to make a choice. Okay? What you don't want to do is make the first choice that you pay for. You always want to exhaust all the other options, especially at something that costs that much. $3,500 is a lot, right? So in that case, I would go to the buyer and say, do you want to pay for this yourself? Well, if the buyer digs their heels in, because sometimes you're going to get a buyer that's stubborn too, and the buyer says, nope, seller has to fix it, or I'm going to cancel, I'm going to walk, that's when you have to stop and decide, is everybody just being a butt, and they're doing it to their own disadvantage? Like, at that point, are they just acting like children, and it's not good for any of them? This house really should close. It's good for the buyer. It's good for the seller. We're almost there. Should it go through? Right? Should I make this work? That's what you have to ask yourself, because if it shouldn't work, then yeah, buyer should cancel at that point. Cancel, go find a different house. But if the buyer can't afford it, or is just really shoot themselves in the foot. Say you're going to walk with a, hold on. I know how much that house is, so just a second. Okay, so say you're going to walk with a $15,000 paycheck. Then I ask myself this question. If I have to spend $3,500 out of my paycheck, I can't count, just a minute. What is that, $1,250? $1,150? Okay, so you're going to walk away with $11,500. What is my time worth? Do I want to start over with this client? Do I want to find a different house? Is there a different house that I can find for them? Are there other options? Or do I fix the problem and move on with my life and walk away with my $11,000? That's what I ask myself. And most of the time, I'm like, you know what? We've been doing this for 4 months or however long, right? Let's just cut it. Like, I'll just fix the problem. Let's close and I'm going to move on with my life. And your client's going to be happy because you're going to fix the problem and you'll get a great review, right? There's some positive things that can happen on the back end of that. And a lot of people will focus, and this seems to me that agents will focus on the negative part. Well, the negative part is, oh my gosh, that cost me $3,500, right? But what's the positive part? Did you just make $11,000? Okay, who makes $11,000 in a month? Doctors? Like doctors. Nobody else makes $11,000 in a month. Lawyers, right? I mean, people don't make that kind of money. I don't know about you, but I didn't make that kind of money before. That's a lot. So you have to look at the positive side of things and not just the negative, and value your time too. Because if you have to start over, man, that's a whole nother trek, right? So you have to start all over again. Stacy said, when something comes up, all 4 of us are going in and splitting it, both agents and the buyer and seller, and everyone sees you're all giving some. That's a good suggestion too, especially when it's a high priced item. See if everybody wants to take a piece of the pie. So exhaust all those efforts to try to keep it together as much as you can. But I will tell you, every once in a while, you will get a situation where if a seller is so difficult and they don't want to fix stuff and they maybe not disclosing everything, then you might want to cut and run anyway. Because if that buyer buys that house, you could find a whole lot of other surprises, right, that you didn't know about. So it could be a blessing in disguise. So you have to really weigh that too. So all this comes in, and I guess this dual representation too, but all this comes in when I explain to you and I teach you about, people aren't just paychecks. The paychecks show up when you do your job the right way. But you have to account and consider all these things when you're doing your job, because it matters so much for your reputation and for the happiness of your clients. That's what matters, is how you're performing, how you're taking care of them. Really important. So that's the way you build a business. That's not the way that that's otherwise you're just one and done, selling a house and moving on, right? And not having that repeat business and referral business. You got to build an actual business. That's what you're working toward. So, anybody else? Not the funnest subject we've ever talked about, but it's an important one. It's an important one. So get to your open houses, pick up your buyers. That's what I say. Pick them up, man. All right. Have a really great weekend. And of course, if anybody ever has any questions or anything, post them in the Facebook group. So, and I think everybody, I don't know if you do or not, but I'm down to less than 100. I stickered mine up because I like stickers and I like Peloton. So that's my problem. Anyway, but I'm down to the last about 100 planners for this year. So anyway, if anybody doesn't have one, I'd get on and get it. We'll get it shipped. So, all right, you guys, thanks for showing up, and I will see you next time.